Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nicole Haldupis, and I'm the Promotions and Publicity Coordinator at the University of Manitoba Press. We're really excited today to launch Being German Canadian, History, Memory, Generations. Today, we will be joined by the editor, Alexander Freund, contributors, Karen Brglez, Sara Frankenberger, and Robert Teigrob, and Vice Consul Frederic, Nicolaus, Erdt from the Toronto German Consulate, who I'll introduce in just a minute. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba Press is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. U of M Press respects the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I just wanted to also point out our next event, if you're interested, is going to be for the Politics of the Canoe. It will be with editors Bruce Erickson and Sarah Wiley-Croats, alongside contributors Rachel Cushman, John Dank, Jessica Duncan, Larry McDermott, and John B. Zoe, as well as Laura Piers from the Canadian Canoe Museum. And that's happening with McNally Robinson Booksellers on June 8th at 7 p.m. You can find more information on our website. Also on our website today, we're happy to offer a discount code for Being German Canadian. If you'd like to order a copy on our website, you can use the code GermanCDN30 to get 30% off. And I will post a link for that in our chat. This is if you buy the book directly through our website. If you'd like to purchase the book elsewhere, we urge you to support independent bookstores. McNally Robinson in Winnipeg and Saskatoon is a great example. And they do ship across Canada. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Vice Consul Frederic Nicolaus Erdt from the Toronto German Consulate. Please welcome Frederic.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me today. My name is Frederic Erdt. I'm the head of the culture department here at the German Consulate General in Toronto. It is my great pleasure to be with you today, at least virtually, in Winnipeg for the launch of Alexander Freund's book, Being German Canadian. I was lucky enough to get my hands on a preprint ahead of today's event and found it a very insightful and fascinating read. Modern day Canada, as you all know, is a nation of immigrants. And judging by the numbers, German Canadians make up a significant part of the multi-ethnic fabric of the country. According to the latest census data, over 3.3 million Canadians have full or partial German ancestry. Yet, among the various immigrant groups, German Canadians garner rather little attention and have a tendency of blending in. This brings me to the first question. What makes someone a German Canadian? Do we focus on the first generation immigrant who came to North America as a pioneer? Or does the term extend to children and grandchildren? Where do we draw the line? Identifying as German Canadian is not just an individual choice. It is also a matter of being perceived as German by your surrounds in Canada. It's a feeling I am pretty much familiar with as a diplomat myself, as in all the different countries I lived and worked thus far. There were always certain expectations, but also cliches and stereotypes that were projected on me as an official German representative. What it means to be culturally German has undergone significant change. The Germany of the 1950s has little in common with today's increasingly multi-ethnic society. The public discourse, norms, and values have changed. Does this reflect in the cultural memory of German Canadians? In other words, do immigrants who arrived in Canada many decades ago practice a different Germanness than newly arrived Germans? Canada does not aspire to be a melting pot. It embraces its cultural diversity. In Toronto, where I live and work, many ethnic communities display their cultural heritage with great pride. We see street festivals and parades by the Greek, Italian, and Polish community, their annual events. The German community is conspicuously absent in this regard, and Alexander Freund's book provides thoughtful explanations into why German Canadians tended to assimilate rather than to showcase their cultural background with a degree of pride, the way we see it with other European immigrant groups. Modern German history is indelibly linked to the period of National Socialism. Many of those who left Germany for Canada were victims of prosecution. For those who escaped the Shoah, the memories of Germany are marked by extreme violence, deportation, and a struggle to survive. Germans who arrived in Canada in the 20th century never were a homogeneous group. They included victims, but also active or silent supporters of the Nazi regime and many shades in between. The interesting question asked by Alexander Freund in the book is to what extent this troublesome history is remembered and acknowledged by German immigrants and their descendants in Canada today. In modern-day Germany, an actively practiced Erinnerungskultur, which loosely translates as a duty and responsibility to remember the crimes of National Socialism, is part of our raison d'etat. But getting there wasn't easy. Especially in the early years of post-war Germany, most preferred to deal with the past by means of silence and denial. This challenge to deal with our history can be witnessed in German immigrant communities in Canada and elsewhere too. For very different reasons, it has been difficult and painful for several generations of German Canadians to remember, acknowledge, and speak about the memories of the Germany they left behind. Alexander Freund's book asks important questions in this regard and shines light on these often neglected issues. For this reason, we are very grateful to you, Alexander, and the other contributing authors for your valuable work of literature of what it means to be a German Canadian. Looking forward to hear from you and to the subsequent discussion together with the other contributing authors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederic. Now, I'm very excited to introduce Alexander Freund. Alexander is a professor of history and holds the chair in German Canadian Studies at the University of Winnipeg. He co-edited Entangling Migration History, Borderlands and Transnationalism in the United States and Canada, edited Beyond the Nation, Immigrants, Local Lives, and Transnational Cultures, and authored Oral History and Ethnic History. He has also published widely in oral history. For this new essay collection, he wrote the introduction and the essay A Flying Piano and then Silence, German-Canadian Memories of the Great War. Please welcome Alexander Freund.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nicole. And thank you to both Nicole and to the University of Manitoba Press for organizing this virtual launch and also for publishing this book. And thank you also to the German Vice Consul for participating in our launch and for this very concise overview, not just of the book, but of much of German Canadian studies over the last quarter century. I want to briefly tell you a bit about this book, and then you will hear from three authors about their research. So I see this book as the third in a series. The first one was a collection of essays edited by Angelika Sauer and Matthias Zimmer called A Chorus of Different Voices, German Canadian Identities, That's what it looks like. And that was published almost a quarter century ago in 1998. This was followed by a second essay collection, which I edited and published 14 years later in 2012. And the title was Beyond the Nation, ? Immigrants, Local Lives in Transnational Cultures. And so today we have another 9 years later, another collection of essays, Being German Canadian, History, Memory, Generations. What holds these 3 books together? All of them presented research in German Canadian studies and engaged with cutting-edge ideas in migration and ethnic studies. All of them brought junior and senior scholars into conversation about the complexity of research about German Canadians. And Being German Canadian focuses the research questions on the ideas of memory and generation. And the basic idea is that being German Canadian does not end with the first generation, that is the generation of those who immigrated to Canada. Being German Canadian also shapes the lives of immigrants' descendants, their children, grandchildren, and even later generations. And it's through memory and the everyday acts of remembering together that different generations are held together. As our book shows, this remembering together is not always an easy process. It's full of conflict and struggle, shame and silence, repressing and forgetting. But it is also full of myth-making, storytelling, values, and community building. The difficult history of Germany in the 20th century ensures that communal remembering must be a struggle. But we know from our research that the German Canadian case is far from unique. Many ethnic groups have similar memory struggles. And as a Canadian nation, we are beginning to understand the challenges of remembering our history of colonization and colonialism. As researchers, we also know that the German-Canadian case is particularly fruitful to explore because the German-Canadian community is so complex and has such a long history. And so we can expect more essay collections in the future. But let us stay with Being German-Canadian for now. You will shortly hear from 3 authors, but I would like to acknowledge the other authors as well. So as Nicolaus said in my own essay, A Flying Piano and Then Silence, German-Canadian Memories of the Great War, I write about German immigrants who arrived in Winnipeg before 1914. They were interviewed in 1971, and I explore why they remained largely silent about the First World War in those interviews. Another contributor is Patrick Farge. He's a professor of German and Gender Studies in the Department of History and the Department of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Paris. In his essay, A Transnational Yiddish Identity, comparing German Jews in Canada and Israel, he asks about the experiences of Austrian and German Jews who fled the Nazis in the 1930s and settled in Israel and Canada. Elliot Worsfold is a PhD candidate in history at Western University in London, Ontario. And in his essay, Gatekeeping in the Lutheran Church, Ethnicity, Generation, and Religion in 1960s Toronto, he investigates a major conflict about language between German-speaking pastors and young seminary students who identified as German Canadian but did not speak German. Anke Patzelt is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Ottawa. Her essay, Migration Trajectories and the Construction of Generational Discourses Among Contemporary German Immigrants in Ottawa in the 2000s, deals with the question of how immigrants who arrived from Germany in the 1990s created self-images in part by contrasting themselves with earlier post-war immigrants. Christine Enslen is a doctoral student at York University. In her essay, Creating Family Legacies, Descendants Memorialize Their German Female Ancestors, She explores history and myth-making in a public memory project in Saskatchewan, where children and grandchildren of German pioneer settlers wrote and published biographies of their ancestors. And finally, Roger Free is a professor of education at Simon Fraser University and an affiliate professor of psychiatry at UBC. He's also psychoanalytic faculty and supervisor at the William Alanson White Institute. And in his afterword, which inspired the title of our book, he asks, what does it mean to be German Canadian? And his answer, he addresses, as he writes, some of the challenges of history and the obligation of memory. So there you have it, a book with lots of food for thought and discussion. And now to our three presenters. The first is Robert Teigrob, a professor in the Department of History at Ryerson University.
Hello, everyone. Can I just get a confirmation that I'm actually on screen and being heard, because I am not seeing. Okay, thank you very much. My chapter is on Mackenzie King's visit to Berlin in 1937, where the Canadian Prime Minister visited Adolf Hitler and came back singing the praises of Hitler and Nazi Germany. The event is largely ignored in Canadian history books, and when it is addressed, authors tend to chalk up King's response to the fact that he was an oddball and his views were not representative of the wider public. I'm not going to challenge the idea that Mackenzie King was an oddball, but I do challenge in my essay the idea that King's views were not representative. 19th century French thinker Ernest Renan declared that in the service of nation building, members of a polity must simultaneously recall collective triumphs and forget many things, especially those events that tear at the fabric of social harmony. Contemporary political theorist Ross Poole makes the conundrum associated with this axiom plain. In order to fulfill this demand, citizens must remember what it is they are commanded to forget. Poole offers a pathway out of this blind alley, arguing that forgetting under these circumstances does not require the complete erasure of the past. What it prescribes is that the erasure of the responsibilities that are associated with it. In the context of King's mission to Berlin, responsibility is expunged when chroniclers of the era simply omit the event, or when they recast the Prime Minister's approbation and servility as principled toughness, or when their narratives replace the statesman who skillfully shepherded Canada through trying times with the guileless mystic clown who bumbled off to Berlin and whose patent weaknesses were no match for Hitler's cunning. The last approach accomplishes the feat of laying much of the blame for Canada's softness toward Nazism at the feet of a single and ostensibly unrepresentative figure. Under all three strategies, certain unflattering truths about the nation's response to totalitarianism are moderated. For example, that Canada could have done more to expose and ameliorate the suffering of Nazism's victims. That the nation shared certain ideological affinities with fascism. That the ideology of racelessness, upheld as a marker of Canadian identity, one that represented Canada as a haven of refuge for groups fleeing persecution, cannot accommodate the collective response to the political extremism of the 1930s. And finally, that the good war was in fact thrust upon a Canada that had few misgivings about doing business with Nazi Germany until Hitler's armies threatened the balance of power in Europe. None of these claims are absent from the historical record, but a more honest reckoning of the purpose and significance of the Prime Minister's visit gives these difficult truths a greater significance and more appropriate presence in the annals of Mackenzie King era Canada. And that's where I'll end. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Robert. Our next presenter is Karen Brglez. She received her MA in history from the Universities of Manitoba and Winnipeg for her excellent research on German unification at the end of the Cold War. And she's currently a research assistant with German Canadian Studies, but is beginning her PhD in the fall. So over to you, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So my chapter is titled The Roots of Ethnic Fundamentalism in German Canadian Studies, the case of Gottlieb Leibrand. And my chapter traces the intellectual biography of Gottlieb Leibrand, who was an ethnic German from the Ukraine. Leibrand immigrated to Germany in 1925 from the Soviet Union, and then immigrated to Canada in 1952, where he settled in Galt, Ontario. I argue in my chapter that Leibrand was a Nazi propagandist. His contributions to the Nazi state were primarily academic in the 1930s. He completed his PhD in Vienna in 1934 from the University of Vienna, and then following his PhD, went on to write anti-Bolshevik and anti-Semitic literature, different articles and monographs. He then immigrated to Canada in the post-war period and established himself as a respectable scholar in German Canadian history. With the explosion of the writing of ethnic histories beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Canada, Gottlieb reproduced his ideas about German ethnicity for a Canadian context. And his work advocated for the Germans, for the importance of Germans as an ethnic group in Canada, and really focused on German contributions to Canadian society. And I argue how this directly influenced German Canadian historiography in the 1970s. So I'm going to read a couple sections from my chapter. Gottlieb Leibrand fled civil war in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and became a leading member in the Russian-German emigre community in Berlin in the interwar period. In Germany, this group of educated emigres worked to foster a pan-German national identity that included Eastern Europe's ethnic German minorities. Isolated from the German national consciousness before the First World War, emigres sought to expand the scope of Germanness to include their compatriots and connect them to a German state that saw an increasing desire to unify the Volk, the people. They envisioned a national community defined not in cultural, but in racial and biological terms. This was achieved with the Nazis' rise to power and the ushering in of a new racial order that categorized individuals according to racial purity. Based on blood, Soviet Germans were increasingly viewed as members of the Volksgemeinschaft, the ethnic community. In her work on ethnic Germans living outside of Germany, Doris Bergen argues that the Nazi racial policy was double-sided. While those who were considered alien, hereditarily ill, or asocial were excluded from the national community, ethnic German minorities came to be perceived as valuable Aryans that legitimized the Nazi mission to obtain so-called living space in the East. According to Nazi thinking, ethnic German struggles under foreign rule outside of the German border served as justification for invasion and occupation. Ethnic Germans needed to be liberated so they could play an important role in Germanizing the East. The Nazi plans for spatial expansion created a demand for professional experts on Eastern affairs. The transnational network of Russian-German emigres in the Reich willingly provided academic and administrative support for the regime's goals and established themselves as professionals ready to aid in the regime's plans to occupy the Eastern territories. As an emigre scholar in Germany, Leibrand's contributions to advancing the Nazi state were primarily academic. A fervent anti-Bolshevik and anti-Semite, Leibrand worked in various agencies as a Nazi propagandist, furthering the myth of the interwar period wherein the German people struggled against various enemies who wished to destroy the German Reich. In this narrative, Russian Germans, together with their white counterparts, were cast as victims of a Jewish Bolshevik threat that intended to annihilate all things German. As a producer of racist scholarship, Leibbrandt participated in the crafting of Nazi propaganda that juxtaposed a victimized vote in a fight against the racial other. He was supported in his academic pursuits by a community of like-minded thinkers. Two of Leibrandt's closest confidants in Germany, his brother George and their associate Karl Stump, produced similar Nazi-era scholarship. With the onset of the Second World War, these educated Russian German emigres found new roles to support the Nazi machine. Leibbrandt joined the Wehrmacht's Eastern Campaign, whereas George and Stump served in administrative positions as part of the German occupation forces in the Soviet Union. By 1941, George was a senior official in the political sector of Alfred Rosenberg's Reich Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories. In addition, he oversaw Stump's Special Action Unit on the Eastern Front, which was responsible for racially categorizing and documenting ethnic Germans in Nazi-occupied Ukraine. In the decades following the Second World War, Gottlieb remains in close contact with both of these men. As a post-war immigrant to Canada, Leibbrandt did not simply abandon his ethno-national past that was marked by his experiences in the war years. Instead, he reproduced his ethno-national ideals in a Canadian context through the writing of German-Canadian historiography. The political awakening of multiculturalism in Canada, beginning in the late 1960s, provided academics with the opportunity to author ethnic studies and ethnic histories. As an expellee immigrant to Canada, Leibbrandt used the burgeoning field of German-Canadian studies as a space to reproduce his ethnic historiography within a Canadian framework. My argument echoes Pascal Meider's theory that post-war expellees did not discard their ethno-national ideals upon arrival in their new environments, but rather reconstructed their national identities to fit the new nation state. Intent on preserving his ethno-identity, the central purpose of Leibrandt's writing was ethnic preservation. His additions to German-Canadian scholarship were contribution pieces, that is, publications that highlighted the positive developments that German immigrants made to their adopted nation, written to advocate for the importance of Germans as an ethnic group in Canada. This philopietistic approach frequently praised the achievements of German immigrants and marked them as a unique and exemplary ethnic group in Canadian society. Furthermore, throughout his work, Leibbrandt recurrently wove a narrative of victimization, an account in which ethnic German suffering was emphasized due to their displacement in the Second World War, or as innocent immigrants who had endured unjust persecution in Canada during the war years. His writings helped foster what Angelica Sauer came to define as a culture of complaint against the German-Canadian community. As the concept of multiculturalism was taking root in Canada, Leibbrandt was, of course, not the only academic to emphasize the importance of his ethnic group in Canadian society. In light of his pre-war work, however, his devotion to producing German ethnic historiography in Canada demands further examination. Notably, Leibrandt's academic scholarship from the 1930s was based on racially motivated Nazi ideology that glorified the German Volk as an ethnic community superior to others both culturally and biologically. In the post-war period, he made no attempts to confront his Nazi past and chose to keep quiet about his earlier racist writings. As Sara Frankenberger notes in chapter 7, the generation of Germans that directly experienced the war dealt with the past through a collective silence regarding National Socialism and the Holocaust. Throughout his German-Canadian scholarship, Leibrandt's ethno-racial attitude persisted as he continued to perpetuate the myth of German cultural superiority. So thank you so much. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening to that, and I look forward to being a part of the question period.
Great, thank you, Karen. And I don't know, Nicole, do we have Sara with us? Oh, I can't hear you. You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. I don't think we have Sara with us. I don't think she's going to be able to make it. So I wonder if we should move on to the Q&A.
That sounds excellent. Okay.
Okay, so can I please invite all of the panelists to join me on screen? Thank you so much it's been so enlightening hearing you talk about your chapters. I want to invite the audience as well. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to type it into the Q&A. Or if you want to, you can join us with your voice. You can raise your hand at the bottom and ask a question that way. Oh, it looks like we've got some hands raised. So why don't we start with a question from Rainer L. Hempel. Hi, Rainer.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, thanks very much for all these presentations. Of course, I'm also a student and a lecturer on German-Canadian history, also through my book, New Voices on the Shores, which deals with the maritime, the contribution of the Maritimes of the Germans via Pennsylvania. But this is not the question I have here. But what I noticed, first of all, that you seem to be concentrating on the violence that shaped integration. Why did you concentrate on violence? Whereas, you know, the German experience, and I mean German, of course, in a much wider sense, you know, not Austrian and Swiss and all this, but the ethnic cultural Germans. This is you know, I've written about this in my book, and I'm quoting somebody else that has said, these Germans had a singular ability to sort of fade in to the Canadian fabric. We know that the immigrants in the 1840s, they were very active, but they never, and in also Canada, we observed this, never active politically. This is not just a result of the violence of the last war, of the Nazism period and so forth, which of course contributed greatly. But this was a German habit, and I just quote this in German, and I know all of you speak German. Gehe nicht zu deinem Fürst, wenn du nicht gerufen wirst. This is part of the German political, cultural experience. That's why so many in the 1840s left Germany, because they had no voice. And when they came to North America, they thought this had to continue. This is, as I say, to concentrate on the violence as to the German silence and the German, what you describe as the German habit or experience, goes much further, goes much deeper. It exacerbated it, but it didn't cause it. And I think we have to be aware of this.
Yeah, thank you, Rainer, for your question. You know, this book does not attempt to deal with all of German Canadian history, but rather focuses on these questions of generation and memory. And that is sort of what we came up against when we interviewed immigrants and their children and grandchildren, when we did archival research on these questions. And, you know, that is what shapes much of German and German Canadian identity constructions and intergenerational relationships in the 20th and the early 21st century. So certainly there are all these other aspects of German Canadian history that you know, have been written about in part. But in part, you know, trying to figure out how the violence of the 20th century continues to shape generations is an important question that we need to ask. And so this is sort of what we set ourselves as the goal for this particular essay collection. And of course, every author has a different answer to this question. I don't know if Karen or Robert or even Frederic want to talk more about this.
I can just speak for my own chapter, but I would say that the violence has been avoided, particularly looking at Gottlieb Leibrand's life. He had a very troubled history, and where he was very anti-Semitic, And this was completely avoided in German Canadian history. He was silent. He never, he never talked about his past, or, never made mention of it. But if we're referring to the history of the war and violence in that context, it was it was avoided. There was no discussion about anything like that related to Gottlieb.
Mhm. Well, it depends how you want to represent the German immigrants here. Whether it's the post-war period, there's no question. My mother definitely came to Canada to avoid the Russians. She'd never wanted to face the Russians again. As a refugee from East Germany, you can imagine that this was the, it was certainly not my experience, not at all. And I just think that this, to concentrate on the violence, is more or less an admission that this is basically post-war, post-Second World War experience. I've just recently published something on the immigrants in the 1930s. Their reason for coming to Canada was the disastrous economic situation in the after the stock market crash. So by doing the violence tack, you're concentrating on the post-war period.
Thanks very much for that, Rainer. I think we've got quite a few more hands here, so I'm going to move on to the next question. We've got a question from Royden Lowen. All right, you should be able to talk now.
Yeah, hi all, and congratulations to all of you on this accomplishment. I have a question maybe for Alex, maybe the others want to join in. The book is obviously an important contribution to Canadian, German Canadian studies. But in your opening comments, Alex, you also, I think, sort of hinted that maybe the book also has wider application to immigration history in Canada generally, and that possibly we have, as immigration historians, still continued in a certain way the sugar-coated multiculturalism of the 1970s, where we have instinctively heralded accomplishments and contribution history and not engaged in wholehearted truth-telling. Do you think this book is situated to be in conversation with those wider themes?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Roy. Very definitely. And I think Roger Free makes that case particularly well in his afterword. So, I mean, we do live, as German Canadians, we come from a nation that has a troubled history, and that requires us to remember the violence of the 20th century, because it forces us to deal with values at the core level. And at the same time, we are beginning to understand similar ideas in terms of our responsibility, our obligation to remember, as Roger Free says, in the Canadian case, remembering the history of violent settlement and colonialism. And that is a question of many generations. It is not just one generation. So all Canadians, in a sense, are beginning to understand that the settlement in the 18th and 19th centuries had a lot of violence that needs to be remembered and acknowledged. And so, in a sense, what we're trying to hope with this essay collection is to get away from this idea that immigrants are these pioneers who open up an empty country, but rather that there was a process of settler colonialism happening, and that not just German immigrants, all immigrants were involved in that, and that the next generations now have to come to grips with that. So we're hoping to sort of expand the whole way in which Canadian historiography is done by looking at these intergenerational relationships and responsibilities, And memory is an important way, an important concept to help us ask questions about how we take on that responsibility and with the kind of research that we do. So rather than simply focusing on, the first generation and making them into these mythical heroes, we are trying to figure out how different generations are caught up in all these different processes. And Karen has written specifically about German involvement in settler colonialism.
That is something that I am currently working on, is looking at a German individual who came in the 1850s, and I looked at his actions through the lens of settler colonialism.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Alan Nanders. I will let you on here. All right. Hi, Alan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, first of all, I really appreciated this webinar and the presenters. I do live in Kitchener, Ontario, always associated with a center of a lot of German background, but this was most illuminating. The question I posed, why post-war German, by German I mean German-speaking immigrants to Canada, seem to have not perpetuated their German language and culture very much with their children and grandchildren. Let me put it into my focus of perception. I am right now 77 years of age. I was 12 years of age when my parents brought me from West Berlin to Toronto. So I was a 12-year-old immigrant child. And yes, my parents had to struggle. My father had a good occupation, but being around age 40, he never managed the English language perfectly to an academic standard. So it was a little more difficult. I grew up, I went to school, I went to U of T, I went to the Canadian military and became a teacher in Toronto for 31 years. And Toronto, of course, had a high degree of various ethnic groups. And being German Canadian, I must admit, as a 12-year-old, the first 4 or 5 years, I had no interest in the language of my parents that was spoken at home. It was only after they had the assurance of perfecting my English, and that went to having no accent, changing my first name to a more Anglo-Saxon Alan. All of that was the thing to do. And then I started looking around. I did my university degree. I studied Germanistic at University of Toronto and even did exchange teaching in Bremen. So my German became fairly good. But then I looked around at German Canadian immigrants, and I have come to my observation that German Canadians were not as devoted to promoting language and culture. And I compare it to, for instance, Ukrainian Canadians, Greeks, and Italians. With the Ukrainian Canadians, until the Soviet Empire crumbled, they of course had no homeland. So many of my students knew all the vegetation and the fish in the Black Sea. Germans didn't do that. And I have come up, I'd love some comments, with 3 possible reasons for it. Number one, that I very much noticed, most German immigrants were born in what I call the verlorene Generation, the lost generation, born somewhere between the early 20s and the mid 30s. Arbitrarily, I think the Berlin Olympics, 36, sort of the end. They grew up, Hitler Jugend, war, bad after war. They wanted to get out of all the mess. So when they came to Canada, there was a great need to acquire material goods, cars, houses, to make up what many people born in Canada perhaps never acquired in their lives. My observation is that post-World War II German immigrants did very well materially, not so well in maintaining language to children and grandchildren. In the 1980s, I taught German Saturday classes in Toronto, and the then grandfathers who had grown up during the war would drop their children off. And invariably, they would say, bye-bye, Heidi and Frank, see you at 12:30, 1 o'clock. Invariably, they spoke in English to their grandchildren they were sending to German Saturday school. So I also tie that to the thing of being German. Man war sehr leise Deutschstolz or stolzer Deutscher. Very quietly being proudly German. The Italians, when they won soccer, it sounded like a happy revolution. The Scots could do it, the Poles. But the Germans somehow had the feeling, don't be too proudly German in a public way. The second split was one of religion, evangelisch-katholisch. In many ethnic groups, the religion, the Poles, were 90% Catholic. So they had a church that bound them culturally as well. Germans were pretty well 50-50 divided. And of course, thirdly, doing well in economics. Even 21 years ago, when my wife and I moved to Kitchener, I thought, well, at least there are many German-speaking roots. On the executive a few years ago of the largest German club, the Concordia Club in Kitchener, most of the people on the executive could understand very little German. Yes, they knew Prosit and Schweinebraten, but you know, I don't know of either any of you folks who are in the academic circles have an observation about the lack of German culture and language in second and third generations. Sorry for being so lengthy.
And that's a good question. And I would say that, you know, one of the problems with the way in which ethnic and immigration studies in Canada and probably elsewhere has developed is that there's a lot of navel gazing, which means that we focus only on our group. And then everything seems to be pronounced and unique in our group. But I think, you know, in terms of language transmission, that is a phenomenon that you will find in probably most immigrant groups. There is, you know, there are, and I haven't, you know, done any studies on that, but just from personal observations, you know, this is something where people feel that their kids can only handle one language. And so they focus on English or French in Quebec. And in order to assure that the kids will assimilate and integrate more quickly. So I think that is a problem that a lot of immigrant groups face, and is not specific to the German group. And you're right, you know, the German group is extremely heterogeneous and diverse. So there are not necessarily German clubs, but after the Second World War, there were lots of Landsmannschaften, right? The sort of the regional clubs that cater to specific regional identities and cultures, rather than sort of a generic German identity and culture. So that too contributes to sort of a fragmentation. And finally, I would say that despite all of the difficulties that German immigrants faced after the Second World War, they still had it easier, I think, than other immigrant groups. I've studied the immigration policies of the Canadian government, and after 1948, and especially after 1951 at the latest, Germans again became privileged immigrants. And so it was much easier for them to integrate socially, and there was no need to sort of stick together, whereas other immigrant groups needed their communities in order to make it economically, to find jobs, and so on. So those are some of the findings that I have found in my own research about this.
Thank you so much for that question, Alan. I'm going to move on to, there's a typed question from Helmut Hess, who says, what differences and what new insights are in these essays compared to previous writings in this genre?
So I mentioned the two other books. So the first essay collection was focusing really on identity and identity construction, and focused really very much on the first generation. The second book, Beyond the Nation, looked at this idea of the continuing connections between German immigrants in Canada and Germany. And so this one really focuses on these ideas of memory and generation, where we really ask questions about not just the first generation, but the succeeding generations, and the way in which they have interacted. And one of the best ways to sort of figure out how different generations interact is by looking at questions of memory, the sort of the negotiation of memory. It's not a simple transmission from one generation to the next, but rather it's an ongoing negotiation of what ought to be remembered and how it should be remembered, and what shouldn't be remembered. These are ongoing family questions and family discussions. So this is sort of what this book focuses on. I don't know if Karen or Robert want to say something more.
Well, and I expand and take that in a slightly different direction by looking at the different generations of mostly English-speaking historians and the way that they've negotiated an encounter with Nazism in the 1930s and beyond. And I think the eraser I was talking about too really enabled Canadians to separate themselves from newly arrived Germans following World War II, because they were able to cast aspersions on what they were doing in Germany at that time without having to ask tough questions about what was going on in Canada. So it enabled a kind of a further muddying of that notion of Canada's response to National Socialism in the 1930s.
Thank you so much for that. So we've got a couple of minutes left and 2 more hands up. So I'm going to ask Rose Brooks, if you'd like to come and say something.
I've unmuted myself, I think.
Yep, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. I have to say first that I found this fascinating, although from the title of the book, once you got into the discussion of the essays, it was not at all about what I thought it was going to be about. So initially the questions I might have had wouldn't apply, and I'll try to keep the background to mine quite short. But I am what I would consider to be a first-generation Canadian, in that my parents immigrated to Canada in their early 20s. separately, one of them in 1949, one in 1951. And I was born here and only spoke German until I was 4. Unlike some of your other callers, my parents stopped speaking German in the house as soon as I turned 4 and was ready to go to school, so that I would be considered Canadian at school and not have a German accent. There still was in the small Ontario town that I grew up in, I would say a great deal of anti-German sentiment based on the Second World War. And so there was not any sense that we would be maintaining German culture, German language at home to make ourselves obviously of German extraction. So that said, my own grown children probably consider themselves German only in as much as they like German beer. I don't know whether my grandchildren will ever really consider themselves German, although their parents tell them they are 1/4 German. Looking at what you've studied in creating your essays, at what point do perhaps not only German immigrants, but at what point do the children of immigrants become simply Canadian and no longer hyphenated? Is it me, or will it be my grandchildren?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I'm not quite sure that it's quite that easy. You know, research from, I think even the 1960s or 70s, or maybe even earlier, you know, asked these questions. And for the United States, researchers found that it was the second generation, your generation, the first generation to be born in the new country, would really strive to assimilate and sort of reject the parents' cultural heritage. But then the next generation would be much more interested in this culture, so that it skips a generation, this interest in heritage. And when you look at the huge interest that Canadians and Americans have in genealogy and in tracing their family histories, I think you see that there is a lot of interest in tracing families back. And even if that does not include you know, speaking the language or knowing much about the culture or the country, there's still an attempt to somehow make this into one's identity. And if you look at the census data, you know, most people who respond to this question of how you identify, they always include more than one ethnicity. And they, you know, this whole question of, you know, are you a Canadian or hyphenated Canadian? You know, until recently, the census didn't even allow you to answer this question as simply Canadian. You know, you had to sort of tell people what your sort of European ancestry was, or other ethnic ancestry. So it's more complex, and people may rediscover it in the 4th, 5th, or 6th generation.
Thank you. That is really interesting. In my own case, I have only just started reconnecting with my German roots now that my parents are no longer alive, because I feel like I am the only connection that potentially my grandchildren will have to a culture that I was not very exposed to. But I'm going to find it very interesting reading the rest of the essays in the book, because I think they will also really inform what I know, since I have very limited family experience. So I'm really pleased that the German Consulate shared this webinar, because I'm finding it fascinating. Thank you very much.
And the book is also a great gateway to more literature, to more detailed studies and so on. So there's a lot of literature there if you want to pursue a certain aspect in more detail.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. And I know we've reached our hour. We do have 2 more questions that I can see. Is everyone okay with answering those? Yeah, okay. So first I'm going to read a question from Lionel Steinman, who asks, who says, my question applies to oral history generally, as well as the present topic. How is it possible to generalize on broad categories of inquiry when different members of a family or community can have opposing views?
Well, as an oral historian, I can say that we try not to generalize, but we try to gain insight into different responses and so on. So what's wonderful about oral history is that you can get different family members together to talk about the same event, for example, and you really see how memory works. You know, they will, I've done this with German Canadian families where I sit them around the table and they talk about the past, and they all believe that they describe the event in the same ways, but they all have three completely different, even opposing, contradictory interpretations. And that then gives you great insight into how memory works and the difficulties often of remembering together as a family.
Thank you so much. We have a hand up, Kirsten Roger, if you'd like to ask your question.
Sure, thank you. Yes. Hello to everybody, and thank you, Alexander, always for your work in this area. And hello to Bob, who I haven't seen in a while. There's so much to say, and it's interesting to hear everybody speak. I'm a first generation immigrant as a child. And so these topics are always have been a thread in my life. And I will say, just partly as a quick response to some of the other speakers, I grew up speaking fluent German at home in Canada. And it has taken a while to find a balance to feeling proud of aspects of being German, which, you know, there's always that fine balance. And I like to remember and think about the good things of the culture as well as the trauma and the violence. So it's all part of my life. In terms of your book, what I find very interesting is this question of remembering. And I always ask myself, what comes after remembering? So it's important to have, I think the topic of memory is very interesting. Is there a time when we think about what we can learn as Germans, also in Canada, what we can perhaps lessons learned for some of the history of racism here, the colonialism here? I think some Germans have done a lot of work in this area. And how can we move forward with this, you know, sort of remembering always the trauma from Germany and thinking forward in Canada, how can we bring that forward? So yeah, maybe that's my question. Is there a book after this? What comes after remembering? And my personal experience maybe is the constant challenge of working against racism and working against colonialism I do call myself a German Canadian. So what do I do in Canada as a German Canadian in this bridging the memory and my current day life? So maybe there's a new book there. Anyways, that's sort of a question. It's rhetorical, but I welcome any responses.
Robert, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. First of all, hi, Kirsten. It's been many years. And secondly, one of the things that inspired the essay that I wrote was walking around Berlin and seeing all the commemorative sites and the very frank engagement with the past, which the Germans engage in to a deeper level than any other society that I'm aware of. And comparing that to what has transpired in Canada, not just with Indigenous people, but also specifically referring to my chapter with the Canadian attitudes toward fascism and a prime minister that was really a Nazi sympathizer. It was a jarring juxtaposition in terms of acknowledgement versus silence. So I don't know if that gets anywhere toward what you're discussing, but I do see incredible need for a deeper excavation of the past and the reasons why Canadians have not been as frank and open about acknowledging their own omissions and sins of the past.
And I think there's also been cultural contributions in a positive way. I think of the prairies specifically. So is there room for a balance there, also thinking about some of those positive contributions in light of this framework of violence and trauma in our history?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Robert has written a book that looks at, aspects of this. Roger Free has published just recently 2 books on this question. One is sort of more autobiographical, but it tackles those questions of, how do you balance the troubling histories of both Canada and Germany as a German Canadian, right? Like you're facing 2 very troubling histories there. And what are your responsibilities, and how far generationally does this responsibility go? Patrick Falsch has also written books on this, looking especially at Canada's not so glorious history of admitting, or rather refusing, Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria during the 1930s. So these are all, books that sort of deal with those questions in more detail.
Can you put those in the?
Those are, yes. So those are all in our bibliography in the book.
Okay.
Yeah, and finally, I would say that dealing with these difficult histories is not optional. We have to do this, but it's not about it's not about German bashing or anything like that. It's about tackling some really difficult and really basic questions about, in a sense, what it means to be a human being and what our responsibilities are as citizens, and what our values are and should be, and how do we want to talk about this with our own children and grandchildren, right? So this is sort of, I think at the core, this is sort of what motivates us all is, it's not just an academic interest, it's also these basic questions about what are your responsibilities when you deal with those hard questions. And I would also say that, again, Germans are not unique. I mean, we certainly have a very violent history, but so do most other nations, I would say. And how do we deal with that? How do we speak frankly with our children and grandchildren about this, so that they don't feel afraid to ask, so that they don't feel ashamed, so that they can feel maybe pride, or I would say that they can enjoy, not just Canadian culture, but also, for example, German culture. I mean, I think one of the wonderful things of bilingualism or multilingualism is that other cultures and other worlds are opened up to you. So I personally am making sure that my children learn German, and so that culture is open to them, that they can enjoy that culture without, it doesn't mean that they can just leave those more difficult questions aside. That's part of, and much of the culture, the great culture of the 20th century in Germany is inspired by these questions of how do we deal with the Nazi past and the Shoah and so on.
Thank you so much for that question, Kirsten. I think that's all the questions we have. So I want to open it up to the panelists if you have any final comments or anything you'd like to add. Before we head off for the day.
Thank you very much for organizing this, Nicole.
Thank you for being here. This has been so I've learned so much. This is great. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you to Frederic and the Toronto German Consulate for joining us and being here. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to buy your copy. The discount code is in the chat. It's German CDN30 on our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.